Hey kids, it's Mr. Fly here, hope you're well, and welcome to another in my occasional series here on the channel of classic bike reviews. The bike that I'm riding today is something that means quite a lot to me. It's a BMW R1200 GS from 2006. 16-year-old bike, a model of which I'm very keen on. I am an owner of a GS and I am a GS fanboy, but I've got the much later liquid cooled version. So what I want to find out in this review is, are these older bikes any good? Stick around, stay tuned, I'll tell you. So if you've been to my channel before and seen any of my videos or tours, you will have seen my BMW GS, which is a 2014 model. And that was one of the first of the liquid cooled bikes. Massive changes on that bike. This is the bike that came before then, and this is just properly air cooled. Far less in the way of electronics. All in all, a much simpler bike. But a bike that was huge for BMW. Of course, it remains huge with the current R1250 incarnation, and I'm sure the vaunted 1300 and 1400s that we're expecting to see later in the year will also be huge for BMW. But this one's sold in bucket loads, and on this ride I aim to find out why. Before we talk about the ride though, let me jump off this machine. I'll show you around this big brute. Let's check out some of the differences between this aesthetically and the current bikes. Alright, let's take a look at this big old beast then and see what the differences are between this, or at least the things I can spot, and the more modern bikes. First off, of course, it does have a somewhat different look about it. The front end, the beak is slightly different, and there's quite a lot more plastics around the front here. The engine itself looks a little bit more simple because this is, as I said, the air-cooled version, not the partially liquid-cooled version that you get on the modern-day GSs. Because of that, underneath the shrouds at the front here, we don't have radiators, which you would have on the new bike, of course. We can see the suspension here on the front. It's got the, what I call funny BMW suspension, the telelever front end, which means you get no fork dive when you brake, which is lovely. The engine itself looks a little bit narrower as well. I think on the newer bikes, the gearbox is positioned differently, so the engine itself looks a different shape. Looks a little bit narrower to me. You may notice, if you're an Anorak on GSs like me, that the shaft drive is on the opposite side here. It's still a single-sided swing arm, but the shaft drive has migrated over to the right-hand side of the bike, so that of course means that the exhaust is on the left. This particular bike fitted with a top box. As you can see, this is the Vario pannier, which is really handy for carrying all my camera kit and what have you, and it's a little bit narrower than the current Vario pannier. Look, in its folded form, it's a bit thinner than the new one. This bike also comes with the side cases. I took them off for the purposes of this review, just so I could show you more of the bike. But yeah, the bike is unmistakably GS still, of course, in that the tank, in fact, reminds me of the tank on the GS Adventure. And then we've got that older school display on there as well. Nothing complicated about this bike, proper analogue bike, one of the last of the analogue GSs really. Big hand guards, and yeah, all very, very nice. Oh, something to point out, I suppose, is the rear suspension on here, which, as I mentioned, is not electronic. There we go, we've got a preload adjuster there, but that is it. And the ride isn't quite as plush as you'd get on a modern day BMW R1200 or 1250 GS, but nonetheless, still a very capable bike. Right, talking of riding, let's jump back on and see how she goes. Okay, welcome back aboard the 16-year-old GS then. And so much for what the changes are like aesthetically. How does she ride? What are the changes like there? Well, I have to say, I thought when I jumped on this it was going to be a bit of a nightmare. First thing I noticed when I jumped on was actually it does feel a bit heavier than the modern bikes. Similar sorts of weights, but it actually feels heavier to get off the stand. It's a longer haul, the side stand is shorter. But once you're riding, it doesn't feel any different in terms of weight. It feels a little bit taller as well when I stop. I'm properly on my tiptoes on this, whereas on my GS I'm a bit more flat-footed. But the riding position is super familiar. It feels just like my GS sat on here. The triangle between the foot pegs where your hands are on your backside is just perfectly positioned in that lovely comfortable GS way. So it feels very familiar in that respect. The seat is very comfortable as well, nice and padded. And again, if I were blindfolded and asked what bike I was on, I would probably say a GS. It does have that familiarity about it, so no problem as far as comfort's concerned. Although again, one big difference is immediately obvious is the suspension. This just has standard suspension. It is adjustable, but the ride isn't as plush as the more modern GSs that have the electronic suspension. I'm surprised how much of a difference that makes. One thing that's different is the indicators on here are the old style BMW ones, in that you have a button on each side of the handlebars for each indicator, and then you cancel it with that button there. Very bizarre, takes a bit of getting used to, but once you're used to it, it's fine. Just a little odd. This air-cooled engine is very similar to the one actually that they use in the current R9Ts. It has a bit more rock and roll than the liquid-cooled ones, in that when you start the bike up you can feel that torque reaction, and when you stop the bike at a junction you can feel a bit more vibration laterally in the bike. It's not bad though. I mean, I would put that down as character. I wouldn't put that down as a bad thing. It's just the way these engines are. Of course, the massive plus of these boxer configuration engines is the fact that the weight is nice and low. So even though it is a heavy bike, it doesn't feel heavy when you're riding it. And for a bike of this size and weight, it's relatively easy to move around, albeit not quite as easy as the current bikes, as I say. The dash on this, you can see how my version of GS, my 2014, how it came to look like it does, because this is obviously the forerunner to that. 2 dials on here and an LCD panel, but not much in the way of electronics. This particular bike, looking down, has done 18,280 miles, so barely run in. Very low mileage actually for a 16-year-old bike. One thing that is noticeably better on this than on the modern bikes is the gearbox. Who would have thought it? The gearboxes on GSs are often criticised as being agricultural. Let's nip by here. Plenty of go on this, I have to say. Yeah, the gearboxes on modern GSs are always criticised, by myself included, as being agricultural. This one actually is smooth as you like. Obviously there's no quick shifter or auto blip or anything like that, but yeah, just going up and down the box, nice and smooth, none of that clunkiness that you get on a modern GS, so that's a plus point. And in terms of go, the engine, I have to say, feels exactly the same as my 1200 GS. The new 1250s have got noticeably more poke, but this one, yeah, it's got exactly that same low down grunt and torque that I'm used to and that I love on the bike, and that so many other people rate GSs for. It's still got all that about it. Alright, we'll come back to the riding in a second. Let's just jump back off the bike then, and I'll talk you through the specs on this bike. So starting off then with this air-cooled engine on here. This is the 1170cc air-cooled boxer twin. Partial liquid cooling came in around about 2013 if I remember rightly. This one puts out 98 brake horsepower at 7,800 RPM. If you compare that with the new 1250, that puts out 134 brake horsepower. So considerably down on power, but it doesn't feel down on power. Torque-wise, 115 newton meters of torque. So yeah, very grunty bike. Front end, looking at the brakes, BMW branded calipers in these days. These brakes work absolutely fine. Twin discs on here. They do feel, if anything, a little bit wooden perhaps compared to the modern day stoppers on the modern day bikes. The suspension on here, the front has got the telelever suspension. We looked at that when we had a look around just now, didn't we? The rear has got BMW's paralever suspension with an adjuster as well. We looked at that earlier on. The seat on here, pretty high actually, 895mm to 915mm. It definitely feels higher than the current GS. I don't know if you could get a low seat for these, but that might be what you want to do if you're a shorty. Wet weight on here is 225 kilograms, and that compares with 249 kilograms on the current 1250. So this is actually 25 kilograms less than the current bike. Which is interesting because it doesn't feel that. It has to be said, if you guessed, you'd say it was the other way around perhaps, because this feels heavier to move around, although once you're actually riding it, it's absolutely fine. Tank capacity on here, 20 litres, so enough for a couple of 100 miles probably. Electronics, basically none. Price of this one, with 18,000 odd miles on the clock, is incredible actually, £5,287 at the time of filming. Now those prices do vary at Superbike Factory. I'll put a link below to this bike in case it's still for sale. It may well have gone by now by the time you see this review, but do check out the link below if you're interested in this particular bike. If not, they'll have plenty of other GSs available for around about that price, so a lot of bike for the money. Just looking over this one and just looking at how the sort of longevity of the fit and finish, actually it looks pretty good. The plastics aren't scuffed, or certainly not on this side anyway. We'll come around the other side. The engine looks in good order, and no corrosion that I can see on the engine cases or anything like that. A little bit of corrosion maybe on the exhaust, but you know, that's always the case on exhaust, isn't it? Otherwise, yeah, the paint on here actually on the shaft drive, the swing arm there is absolutely fine. On my bike it's slightly blistered, but this one no problem there. The exhaust looks like it's held up pretty well. Yeah, it's all looking pretty good. On a cursory glance, I can't really see anything wrong with it. The screen maybe is a little bit scratched, you could replace that. Now I think for a 16-year-old bike it's held up rather well. Okay, welcome back aboard the 16-year-old GS. Well, I have to say I'm having a lovely ride. It rides really nicely, this. The engine is as sweet as a nut. I said before we went through the spec that I thought the gearbox was actually better on this bike than on the newer bikes. What about it isn't so good? Well, the indicators I'm still getting used to. That's just a small point. Less electronics I think is actually probably a good thing, but of course it doesn't even have ABS. Strike that! Just noticed, got an ABS button on here. It does have ABS on here, and it looks like you can defeat it as well if you want to go off-road. So yeah, what do I know? It does have ABS on this bike. And as I mentioned earlier on in the review, the bike does feel a little bit heavier to pull off the side stand than the current bikes do. But once you're moving, it feels exactly the same weight-wise. Other than that, you could argue that the newer bikes look better. I would certainly argue that. It's entirely a subjective thing. But this thing still looks purposeful and rugged. The engine sounds nice. The engine actually sounds quite different to the liquid-cooled variant. It's got more of a sort of a whine about it. It's quite nice. More whiny, less farty than the newer bikes. The clutch on here as well as the gearbox is nice. It's nice and light. I guess the other thing that's noticeably not as good is the suspension, electronic suspension on the modern bikes. This doesn't have that, and it's not quite such a plush ride as the newer bikes. It's not a million miles away, to be fair. And the beauty of getting a bike like this, if you do like to do proper adventure touring, by which I mean big miles on motorways and stuff, and touring, and then doing a bit of off-road as well, if you've got a bike of this vintage and price, you don't have to be too precious about it if you do take it off-road, which this would be very capable at, I'm sure. You don't have to worry so much about dropping it and damaging it, because it's not such an expensive beast to repair. There's a little bit more vibration through the handlebars, I guess, on this bike. This engine does have more character. It's not intrusive though, so I wouldn't put that down as a bad point. The comfort is all here though. The comfort's just as good as a modern bike. So when I kicked off the video, I said, are these any good? Are they as good as the new bikes? Is it worth having an older one? Well, I have to say, yes. It's a very nice bike still. It's got all that DNA of the current GS, so you can see how that bike's been developed to the point where it is. It's got all the good things about this. That grunty engine, comfortable, nice and protected from the weather. It's got a better gearbox. It's got some quirky things, less electronics, not quite such a plush ride, but overall, for the money, an awful lot of bike. I thoroughly recommend it to the house to you. So yeah, don't just think new is always the way to go. Check out the links below to the website for Superbike Factory. I'll have loads of older GS's for sale there. Alrighty, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed this latest of my classic reviews. There will be more coming along soon. Do put any suggestions in the comments below of bikes you'd like to see on the channel. I can basically get hold of stuff up to 20 years old, so don't go asking for really old stuff or stuff from the 80s, as much as I'd love to do those. But any bikes in the last 20 years I could probably get hold of. And what I shall do is select the bikes that basically mean something to me, bikes that I missed out on before I started riding back in 2012, bikes that were kind of my poster bikes, if you like, at that time. Maybe things that I was afraid to ride because I was intimidated by them. Can't wait to bring you more of those reviews. So massive thanks to Superbike Factory for making these bikes available to me. Do go and check out their website. They are Europe's largest used bike dealer. They have over 2,000 bikes in stock at any one time. It's just an incredible place. If you're in the area, then go and check them out. Good cafe and stuff. It's just a good destination to go for a little bit of a ride out as much as anything. Or if you're not in the area, check out the website. You just stick in the bike and model that you want and up pops all the bikes they've got available, and they usually have pretty much everything there. And they'll deliver the bikes to you as well. Anyway, that's enough of an advert. Hope you enjoyed the video. Look forward to speaking to you again soon. Until then, this has been the Mr. and Fly. Cheerio.